Real quick, I have something incredibly fun to share with you. I'm currently running a special giveaway for listeners of the podcast, and the prizes are honestly kind of awesome. I'm giving away 3 free in-depth editorial reviews of first chapters. Yep, that's right, the most important chapter of your novel, the one that has to hook readers, agents, and editors. And on top of that, 5 additional writers will win free admission to any 2026 class I offer. Here's how to enter. All you need to do is leave a review for this podcast on Apple Podcasts. Once you've done that, scroll down to the show notes and click the link called Podcast Giveaway Entry Form. It's super quick and easy. The giveaway is open for 2 weeks, and I'll announce the winners right here on the podcast. So, if you want a chance at free editorial feedback or a free class spot, make sure to leave that review and then fill out the podcast giveaway entry form so I know whose name to put in the prize hat. Okay, back to the episode. Are you struggling to make sense of story structure? Or are you wondering if you're doing it wrong? Well, if that sounds like you are certainly not alone. That's why in this episode, I sit down with Gabriela Pereira, founder of DIY MFA, to talk about story structure in a way that feels empowering instead of intimidating. We zoom in on the classic 3-act structure, break down the role of pivot points, and explore how structure works best as a cross-check rather than a paint-by-numbers formula. Hello, and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Writing Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, founder of the World Shift Writing Summit, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world, too. Hi, Gabriela. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I am super excited to chat with you today about story structure.
I am so excited to be here, and story structure is literally my favorite thing to talk about. So I am totally tickled pink by the prospect.
I love story structure too. It's something that I just think so many writers get scared about, but it is one of the most beneficial things to understand. So I know that my listeners are going to get so much out of our conversation today. But before we dive in, for anyone who is not familiar with you, I would love for you to tell me a little bit about you and why you decided to found DIY MFA.
Yeah, so I'm the founder and instigator of DIY MFA, which is the do-it-yourself alternative to a Master of Fine Arts in Writing. And basically, it all started when I was in graduation from a traditional MFA program. And, I half expected the skies to part and beams of light to come down, and some voice would whisper from on high, you are now a writer. And, I felt like I was going to have all this wisdom dumped into my brain in this graduation moment. And of course, that totally didn't happen. But what did happen is I had this wackadoodle idea. I started thinking to myself about all my friends who were writers but weren't in the MFA program, and how a lot of them would come and tell me oh my gosh, I'm so jealous. I wish I could do it, but I can't. I have a day job. I wish I could do it, but I've got 17,000 children, whatever the things are that are impeding somebody from doing a traditional MFA. And I realized when I was sitting in graduation that a lot of the things that I had learned, I was happy to have had that experience, but I could have probably taught myself a lot of those things. Now, it would have been much longer of a process. I would have had to figure it out and cobble it all together. And it wouldn't have been a one-stop shop. You get in, you get out, you're a writer kind of thing. Yeah. But, the fact was, I realized that this thing could be done on your own. And so after coming to that idea, I did what any normal writer, any self-respecting writer does when they have an idea. I went home and I wrote about it. And at the time, I had a teeny tiny blog that it was a personal blog, where I blogged about what I had for breakfast and stuff like that. And I had 12 followers. One of them was my mother. And I was, I wrote this whole long thing about the DIY MFA concept and what I thought about it. And at the end I wrote if this existed, would you do it? And I expected this to go off into the ether and never to be heard from again. People were just going to ignore it. It would just disappear. But it didn't. The next morning, I woke up and I had like, I don't know how many emails in my inbox of people being like, I want this thing. And all these people commenting on the post saying like, I would totally do this if it existed. You need to build it. And so I realized I had hit a nerve. So the next thing I did is, I have a background in psychology, a background in science and research. So I knew that I needed to test the concept. So I went and I created a test for myself. So this was back in 2010, which was kind of the heyday of blogging. Like a lot of people had blogs and they blogged about their thoughts and their travels and all of those things. And a lot of common conversation happened on blogs. Like we didn't have social media in the way that it is now, where people sort of have their conversations there. So blogs were really big. So I decided what I was going to do was I was going to blog about this idea for 30 days, the entire month of September. And I picked September because it was like back to school time. So I felt like it was, at least where I live, it's back to school time. So I felt like it sort of fit, the whole vibe. And the thing I was testing two ideas. First, I wanted to see if I had enough things to say to last me a whole month, because I figured if I ran out of things to say, then this isn't going to go anywhere.
Right.
And then the second thing I was testing was, are people going to listen? Like, are people actually going to participate and be interested in this and whatever? So I figured, one of two things would happen for each of those questions. If I, in testing whether I had enough things to say, either I'd go to the end of September and like lop over into October and November, et cetera, or I'd run out of things to say and then I'd stop the experiment early. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, with the audience question, I figured, either people were going to just disappear and it would be like me and my mom on the blog by ourselves, or we'd have more followers, like I'd get a few more followers or whatever. So what ended up happening by the end of September is I not only had enough things to say that I went like halfway into October, so that part was solved, but I also went from 12 followers to about 400, which at the time, given the way things were in the internet back then, 400 followers was like a big jump to make.
Right.
So at that point, I realized like, okay, this thing works. This thing is interesting to people. I have stuff to say about it. So then from there, I started building out the curriculum and I started developing like what the different avenues of DIY MFA were going to be, the different pillars. So eventually it became our 3 pillars of write with focus, read with purpose, build your community. And now, it's courses and we have a membership community and we have all sorts of webinars and, workshops that we run and all sorts of things. So like, it's kind of, it wasn't what it is now immediately. It took many, many years to get to this point. But that was sort of the beginning and sort of how I figured it out at the beginning.
Oh, wow. And so when you first came into this, it was really from just wanting to give people something that they couldn't necessarily have access to on their own. Did you find yourself as you were creating it thinking, oh, I can do this better than the way I was taught, and I can use resources and structures that speak to the things that I know might have been missing from the MFA program? Because I know so many writers come out of MFA programs thinking, but I still don't know how to do this.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I want to say like, this is not me hating on the MFA, the traditional MFA. I love the traditional MFA. And I firmly believe that the traditional MFA serves a very specific group of writers incredibly well. If you're writing literary fiction and you want to teach, that is where you need to be, because that's, you need that credential to be able to do it. But if you're writing, genre fiction or children's books or, what have you, then you can kind of get the same experience on your own. And to your question, a lot of the things that ended up sprouting at DIY MFA kind of organically were things that weren't in the traditional MFA model. So like I started the traditional MFA or the DIY MFA sort of taking from the, and borrowing ideas from the traditional, but then we started sort of adding things to it. So like the idea of building your author platform, that's something they didn't teach me in the MFA program, but it's such an important component of being a writer. And so we ended up doing that, like including that in our flagship course, and people loved that module so much that then we got, people clamoring for more. So we built an entire course on building your author platform. So, it kind of was an organic process. Like I sort of saw like, what are people asking for? What are people needing? And then sort of building things to solve those problems.
I love that it really is in response to what writers need and what they're not getting anywhere else. And all right, so let's go ahead. And now that we know a little bit more about you and this wonderful platform that you've built, let's talk about my favorite, which is story structure. And even more so than that, we're going to specifically sort of hone in on the 3-act structure, which is another one of my absolute favorites. So because there are so many different story structure methods out there, why the 3-act structure? Why does this one appeal to you? What about it just makes it the thing that you like to teach?
So for folks who aren't familiar with the 3-act structure, it originated with Aristotle, and it was developed originally, like the whole idea was just beginning, middle, and end. Like that's what Aristotle came up with, right? And it was developed as a way of understanding Greek tragedy. So we need to understand and acknowledge that it comes from a very specific source. It's not something that's just sort of been floating in the ether and like universal kind of thing. Because a lot of people treat story structure like it's universal, and we have to recognize that story structure that works in one context may not work in a different context.
Right.
The other thing to consider is that you mentioned there are a lot of different methods out there, but when you look really closely to them, they're kind of all saying the same thing, but with different words. Like
I tell the writers I work with that all the time. I'm like, no, once you read enough craft books, you understand it's all the same stuff because story is story, right? It's just the same thing appeals to our brains. It doesn't matter what words you put on it. I love that.
And, it's funny you mentioned brains because there's actual research that says that story is embedded in our neurology. So there was a study done by this group, Hassan et al. In NYU, where they had people, in fMRI machines, and they were like looking at their brain patterns and seeing like, the complexity of their brain patterns. And they showed them different videos. And the videos that had more storyness to them had more complex and interesting and more sort of universal brain patterns, like the brain patterns of person A and person B and person C kind of like came together in a way that you didn't have with the less story, videos that they were watching. So that shows that like story structure not only is embedded in our brains and it's part of like how we think about things, but it also is sort of like a unifying factor. It's one of the things that kind of brings people together, that like we experience the same story. We're kind of in it together.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true. I mean, the idea of what appeals to the brain, I mean, it's just the brain experiences story in one way. And so many different, very intelligent people are going to discover the same truths about story over and over again. And they're going to put different names to it, but it's really fundamentally appealing to how our brain processes information and what makes our brains like information, which is helping us to understand what might be good or bad about things that we do, right? Giving us a model so we know we don't have to do all the mistakes ourselves, right? We can learn from story, which is fantastic.
Exactly. There's other research that says that story is basically like a life simulator, that you kind of experience things in a story that you might not experience yourself, but you feel like you're there. And that then creates this sort of feeling of empathy that you have that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I have never and probably will never experience the upside down. But if you're a Stranger Things fan, you absolutely know what you would do and not do if that ever occurred, right? We learn really great things from story. So when you first learn, I know a lot of writers, when they are first coming to any story structure, but since we're talking about the 3-act structure, we'll talk about that one. They're like, wait, this makes no sense. Did you, when you first learned about it, did you feel that way, or did it always just feel really intuitive to you?
It was pretty intuitive from the get-go. What my brain did when I was learning about 3-act structure, and then eventually like DIY MFA has its own sort of modified version of the 3-act structure and sort of our way of looking at it. Again, our way is not the only way. There are many ways out there. What works for you is what you should go with. But Yeah, it was more like me putting words to things that I already knew. Like, and I had a similar experience like that in college. So I played the violin and I
Mhm.
learned a lot of music theory intuitively by playing the violin since I was 4. But I didn't really take like a true heavy duty music theory class until I got to college. And I remember taking these classes and being like, oh, wait, that's what a diminished seventh chord sounds like. I know what that is. Now I have a
Yeah.
name for it. And it's really amazing how powerful it is when you name the thing. Like if you have the word associated with the thing, suddenly you understand the thing in a way that you didn't understand it before.
That's so true. I remember when I first started reading about story structure, that's what I found. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the part. Like the part at the end where this thing always happens. I remember being like a teenager and it was just like my mind was blown because I was like, oh, they're doing it on purpose. I don't know how else I thought they were doing it, right? But I was like, oh my gosh, all that stuff that I've seen, they're all doing it on purpose and it's there and I'm not imagining it. It's in all stories, right? So it's that moment where what you know intuitively meets what you know intellectually, and suddenly you have that aha moment, right?
Absolutely. And I want to add also that, there's a big debate between plotters and pantsers, right?
Oh,
Pantsers
yeah.
are the people who write by the seat of their pants. Plotters are the people who like plot out every last little detail. And I personally think that both methods can work and you need to do what works for you. But um, it's important to think about 3-act structure not as a paint by numbers method. It's not like you're going through your 3-act structure and you're like, okay, act one, I've done this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. And then act two, I've done these 17 things. And then act three, I've done these 4 things. Because then the writing's going to feel stilted. It's going to
Yeah.
feel stiff. It's going to feel artificial. It's not going to feel right. So what I recommend always is use the 3-act structure as a cross check. So write the thing as you feel like it needs to come out, whether you have an outline or you don't, you're writing it sort of organically.
Yeah.
And then you go back and you see like, okay, do I have these 3 things in my act one? Do I have these other things in act two? Do I have these other things in act three? And so using it more as a way to check your work as opposed to a sort of prescriptive method that's telling you what to write.
Yeah, and I love that idea. And that is often what, when I'm working with pantsers, I'm like, no, it really doesn't matter. You can use the 3-act structure in so many ways, or any, story structure. It's about knowing what it is, because I find that when you deeply understand the 3-act structure, even if you're a pantser, you're going to be, for instance, I'm writing towards a midpoint. I know what a midpoint is. I know what it's got to do. And therefore, your brain is just automatically, subconsciously solving problems for you. So just knowing about how it all functions makes your life like 100 times easier, no matter your method of when you think you're applying it.
Absolutely. It's like once you know it, you internalize it, and then
Mhm.
it just sort of happens organically, like it
Yeah.
comes out as needed. But if you're trying to sort of force it, then it's going to come out stilted and stiff and just not great writing.
Yeah, and especially in the first draft, it's because when a writer, no matter if they're a plotter or a pantser, when they're writing the first draft, there's just so much that they don't know about their story or how their characters work. So it's so important to sort of be loose and flexible at that point, and being able,
Mm.
just let the story come out and then take a hard look at it at the end and say, what were its strengths? What were the things that needed to be improved? And how can I now use my understanding of story structure to shore up the parts that, might not be working so well?
Exactly.
And speaking of your method of doing it, I love your formula. So I'm going to bring it out and you can explain it. It's the 3 + 2 = 1, which when I was jotting down questions to ask you, it's so funny because Word did not like my math at all. It kept correcting me. I'm like, no, Word, it's 3 + 2 = 1. I promise you.
Yeah, so I'm not bending the rules of mathematics here, but in my world, 3 + 2 = 1. And so what it means basically is you've got 3 acts, you've got 2 pivot points, and those are the points where Act One transitions to Act Two, and then when Act Two transitions to Act Three. And then the equals one is it equals one classic story structure. And the word classic is really important. First, it's a nod to the fact that it comes from Aristotle, so classic, but also the fact that it's not universal, because there are cultures where there is a four-act structure. I've actually been reading up, and it's very interesting, and it's a totally different way of telling a story. And just because this is what works in like basically Western culture doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the way of telling stories across the whole world, everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's so important actually to realize, because I have worked with folks who are coming to me from multiple different cultures, and the storytelling is just so different in some places. And I think that especially when you're a writer who is coming into a Western way of telling stories, the idea is to never think you're doing it wrong because your story doesn't match what you're being told. And like, wait, it can have so many different structures. So that is such an important idea.
Exactly.
So I loved the way you said that you have these two pivot points, and you describe story as not as a series of things that happen to the protagonist, but as a series of decisions the protagonist makes in response to the things that happen to them. So can you talk about that, along with that, the idea of the two pivot points?
Yeah, so the two pivot points, one of them is from Act 1 to Act 2, and the other one from Act 2 to Act 3. And really, to understand the three-act structure, it kind of makes sense to start at the beginning.
Yeah,
and like give us a little bit of context on like what the acts are, because otherwise the pivot points in isolation don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense.
That makes sense. So let's dive into Act 1 then. Start us there.
So Act 1 is the status quo. Act 1 is the before picture. I call it the before picture, kind of like, those infomercials that used to play at like 2 a.m. on like cable TV, where you've got like, the big beefy guy and then the wimpy guy with the vitamin supplements. And like, if you don't have the photo of the wimpy guy with the vitamin supplements, you don't know that the big beefy guy actually, the vitamin supplements are what made him into the big beefy guy, right? Like you need that. You can't figure out causality, and you can't figure out like the contrast. Like the contrast makes no sense if you don't have that before picture. You need to see the before picture. Yeah. So in Act 1, that's where you're establishing the ground rules of your story. So this is where you're going to establish things like, how does the point of view work? How does the voice work? Are you in the first person point of view? Are you narrating through a character, or are you narrating sort of outside looking into the story in the third person POV? How does that all work? Who is the main character? It's very rare for the main character not to show up in Act 1, although there are examples of stories where the main character actually shows up in Act 2. The Great Gatsby is an example of that. But when you have that character, the reader needs someone to root for. Like they need someone to care about. Otherwise, stuff just happening doesn't really resonate with the reader. Like a tornado happening, if Dorothy isn't in the house in the tornado, like the tornado, we're like, whatever, Yeah. So we need like stuff happening, but we also need somebody that's involved in the stuff happening. So you need that main character. You need to establish the world of the story. So like, where is the story taking place? Is it a galaxy far, far away? Is it in, our backyard? Like, where is the story happening? And then you also need to figure out two other things. There needs to be some sort of a problem, because characters being happy is not interesting. Like,
sadly, it's not.
It's really not. Like, people aren't just going to read a book where the characters are happy the whole way through and everything's hunky-dory. Like, we need things to go wrong. And the way to get that ball rolling is by having some sort of a problem right from the get-go. So there needs to be something, and it doesn't have to be the central problem of the story, but it's usually either related directly to the central problem, or it's sort of alongside the central problem of the story.
Yeah.
And the other thing you need at the beginning in Act 1 is an event. There needs to be a reason why the story starts here and not here or here. Like, there needs to be a reason for why the story starts today and not 5 weeks ago or, next week. So those are sort of the things that you need to like establish in Act 1. Like, those are kind of the ground rules that you need to set up. Once you've set those ground rules up, you get to the first pivot point. And so to your question, how do the pivot points work? There are basically two parts to the pivot point. There's some external event, something happens, and there's some internal choice that the character makes. Now, this isn't to say that the character only makes two choices in the entire book, because that would be really boring.
Oh, yes.
These are kind of like the big choices, the sort of tentpole choices that kind of drive the story forward. But everything that happens in the book has to come from either the character reacting to something, the character making a choice about something, or the character experiencing something. Like the character needs to be involved in everything that's happening in the story, or else the story is not really a story. So with the external event and the internal choice, these can play out in any number of ways. Sometimes it's like really obvious what the external event is, and the external choice is really subtle. An example of that would be the film The Wizard of Oz. The external event is the tornado plopping her house down in Oz. Like, that's the big thing. Mm-hmm. The internal choice is really, really subtle. It's the moment she opens the door and we go from sepia-toned Kansas to Technicolor Oz, and she crosses that threshold into the new world of Oz. She could have just sat there in her house waiting to be rescued for, 2 hours of movie, and it would have been a really, really boring movie. But like, she had a choice. She didn't have to go out into Oz, but she makes that choice to go out into Oz. And that choice then drives the story forward because it sends her on that whole adventure. On the other hand, you might have a really obvious external choice or internal choice, sorry, and less obvious external choice, external events. So the Pride and Prejudice, which is one of my favorite books, has a cascade of external events. Like, Mr. Darcy is basically being really mean to Lizzie over and over and over again. Like, there's at least 3 instances of him being really mean to her. And then her sister gets sick. Her sister is at Netherfield. She wants to go and see how her sister's doing. So she picks up her skirts and plops through the mud across the fields and gets to Netherfield all muddy and whatnot. The external events are all of those little cascading like dominoes of like mean things that Darcy did. The choice is her deciding, even though I kind of hate this guy and I hate like most of the other people that are at this house, I'm still going to go because my sister's there and I need to be with my sister. So that's the internal choice. So the choice is really obvious. The external events are kind of more subtle.
I love that. So it really is it's always about how the external world meets the internal character, which is why writers really have to, I think, know their characters very well, because it's not about just putting a cardboard cutout of a person in there. It's like, because your character is who they are going to make certain choices that another character might not make in that. So what really reveals, I think, and causes the trajectory of the story to go the way it does is the person your protagonist is and the choices they make. So it's not about what happens to them, it's about their choices. Like, exactly. As you said, Dorothy chose to open that door. And, each character is making a definitive choice, and many definitive choices throughout that another character might not make.
Exactly.
And so when we are moving into Act 2, so the character has had some external thing happen, and now they've made a choice and they've stepped out of their normal world and they've stepped into this new story world, which might have changed from sepia to very, very colorful, at least in the reader's imagination. Act 2 is big and daunting. And this is where so many writers just feel overwhelmed. And I've noticed that a lot of the writers, when I first start to work with them, it almost is like okay, well, and then this happens, and then that happens, and then what else can I make happen, right? So can you start pulling that apart for us? How can we turn it from, this, I don't really know what goes here, and then this, and then that, to because of this, that, and sort of feeling much more secure with this area?
Yeah. So I like to think of it as having like little tricks in your back pocket, like little techniques that you can kind of like pull them out and be like, oh, I'm going to use this one. So one of those techniques is the supporting cast. This in Act 2 is usually when you get new characters showing up. Sometimes it's by necessity. And by the way, I want to emphasize too, that first pivot point, I call it the point of no return because it's a one-way door. The character
Mhm.
can't suddenly decide like, oh, I'm going back the way I came. Like Dorothy can't just be like, I'm going to get back in the house and maybe another tornado will take me back to Oz. Like it doesn't work that way.
Right.
So, the only way through the story is through the story. Like they can't just turn around and go back the way they came. So what happens a lot of times when this character is in a new world, this happens a lot in stories like The Wizard of Oz, where they are literally in a new world. But it can also happen in other scenarios where they're in their normal world, but they're just meeting new people. They're having more opportunities for new people. So like in Pride and Prejudice, this is where the militia shows up and Mr. Wickham is there. And so that whole complication comes into play. It's also where she goes on various trips. Like she goes first to visit her friend Charlotte, who's just gotten married, and she has all those interactions there. And then she goes with her aunt and uncle to the lake country. So there are all these things, like you can kind of take your character on little mini adventures, or you can bring in new characters that are kind of being introduced as Act Two develops as a way to kind of keep the momentum going. And what's interesting with supporting characters is that a lot of times they bring with them subplots. Now, not every supporting character will have a subplot. In fact, you don't want too many subplots or you're going to confuse your reader. But usually when you have a subplot, there's a character who's attached to that subplot. So like the Mr. Wickham subplot of like his whole trajectory and what happens with him at the end of the story, like that's a subplot. And he's kind of the anchor character that holds that subplot together. In The Wizard of Oz, you've got the Wicked Witch of the West and the sort of evil villain subplot. She's the character that anchors the story together. They didn't need to have a witch necessarily, but I mean, obviously it's in the original story, but like, you could have Oz without a witch, but it would be very, very boring. So you need to have, so she brings in this whole other subplot, this whole other side story that kind of works its way as Dorothy is trying to get back to Oz or to Kansas.
Yeah, it is that time when you can bring in those characters who are going to help your protagonist, whatever the big thing they have to learn. Usually there's some sort of a subtle lesson, depending on, who you're writing for and what the story is about. It can be more obvious or more subtle, but a lot of times those Act Two people are there to sort of facilitate that learning and kind of
exactly
push your character into new places. Yeah.
And think about it like in the Wizard of Oz, what happens in the Wizard of Oz? She meets the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. And so like, she's kind of going on her journey and making friends as she goes. And that sort of helps to keep the story going. Like it kind of gives us something like what's going to happen next. Well, she just met the Scarecrow, so let's have her meet another character. It's the Tin Man. And then let's have her meet another character. It's the Cowardly Lion. What's interesting also, and another technique that you can sort of pull out of your back pocket is the rule of three. So 3 is a very special number because it's the smallest number where you can build a pattern and then break that pattern all in that same group of things. So, if you only have 2 things, then if they're the same, well, that's not breaking the pattern. And if they're different, well, then there's no pattern to begin with. But you need the third thing in order for there to be a pattern and then break it. And there are actually 2 different flavors of the rule of 3. There's the Little Pigs version, like House of Straw, House of Sticks, House of Bricks does not fall down. Like 2 things are the same, the third thing is different. Or you could have the Goldilocks version where the first thing, like the porridge is too hot, the porridge is too cold, and then it's just right. So the 2 first things are similar, not because they're the same, but because they're polar opposites and they're extremes. And the third one is different because it's the middle ground. It's just right. So usually when we see the rule of 3, we see the first version, we see the Little Pigs version, but the Goldilocks version does come up. I mean, obviously in the story of Goldilocks, but there are other places too where the Goldilocks version might come up. But what you can do is, when you see things happening in your manuscript, like let's say you've got a character and they've had a fight with one character, and then they had a fight with another character, and you've had 2 fight scenes. And then you're like, well, maybe I should make a third fight scene. And maybe like they lost the first 2 fight scenes, but they win the third one. So like you can kind of look for patterns in your own writing and then see if you can turn them into a rule of 3. Or you might have like 4 things that happen, and you might ask yourself, okay, how can I smush 2 of those 4 things together to create a rule of 3 so that it doesn't feel like so many of the same things are happening over and over and over again. And the rule of three really resonates with us as humans. Like we kind of feel it in our gut in a way that like four things or five things just doesn't resonate in quite the same way.
And is the rule of three, what is it best for? Is it best for characters or situations, or does it really apply equally to anything?
It can apply to anything. Like you can use the rule of three for three different characters. You could use the rule of three for three different similar events. For example, in Pride and Prejudice, you've got three proposals. You've got Mr. Collins proposing, and it goes horribly wrong because he's weird. And then you've got Mr. Darcy proposing, and that goes horribly wrong because he's kind of a jerk at that point. And then you've got Mr. Darcy proposing again at the end of the book, although we don't see it on the page, which is interesting, but we know it happens because she talks about it. And then it works. Like then they get together and they're happily ever after. So, that's an example of like three events happening. You could also have like three different locations. So, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, again, you've got Jane, Lizzie's sister, goes to London. So that's one location. Then Lizzie goes to visit her friend and her cousin, Mr. Collins, in Hunsford. So that's another location. And then she goes with her aunt and uncle to the Lake Country in Pemberley, and that's another location. So you've got sort of three different places that things are happening in. So you can use it in any number of different ways.
Oh, that's so fun to have that little trick to pull out especially if you start to see things that might be patterns that you could bring up. And then, obviously human brains love patterns. So they're going to be itching to find them, whether you want them there or not. So it's nice to be cognizant of, am I creating a pattern and how do I do it really well?
Exactly. And it can also be a cross check for making sure that you don't have too many of the same thing in the story, because too many, like if there had been like 7 locations in Pride and Prejudice, it would have been overwhelming. And the reader would be like, okay, where are we going now? Like,
yes. So how about the midpoint? The midpoint is a big thing that happens at the center of the novel that everyone is confused about because it's called so many things. We talk about it like the mirror moment or the midpoint. So what's supposed to happen at a midpoint?
So the midpoint, again, has two components. Something happens, like an external thing happens, and the character has a moment of self-reflection. Now, this is different from the pivot points because now the character isn't necessarily making a choice, although they can make a choice at the midpoint. There are examples of it. But really what makes the midpoint is the character looks inward and they ask themselves, do I like what I see? Do I like who I've become? And what am I going to do about it? Yeah. So the external thing also has two different flavors. You can either have it be a temporary triumph. That's that yes moment, where like the character, it looks like the character got what they wanted. Like Dorothy got to the Emerald City. Yay. And now she has to go kill the witch. Oh no. Yeah. So, like it's like we think we've gotten there and then we didn't. On the other hand, you might have a false failure. And that's where it looks like everything has gone horribly wrong. And yet it hasn't. It sort of opens the door for things to work out later. So an example of that is Pride and Prejudice. The central proposal where Darcy proposes to Lizzie is the midpoint. And the midpoint actually spans several chapters. It starts at the proposal. They have the whole big fight. And then he writes her a letter. Then she reads the letter. And then she has that famous line where she says, "Till this moment, I never knew myself." That is the end of the midpoint, and that is the self-reflection. So the proposal going horribly wrong, that's the false failure. We think like, no, you're supposed to get together. I remember the first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I'm like, this is wrong. Why is this happening? Yeah. Like, Jane Austen, you messed up. And then, of course, I got to the end of the book and I'm like, oh, I get it now. But so like the false failure should feel like that. Like the reader should feel like, wait a minute, you're getting it wrong, author. And then it kind of gets better. And then you have that moment of self-reflection. The "till this moment, I never knew myself" is the perfect example.
Yeah. And I think so the midpoint is so pivotal, no pun intended, because it's not a pivot point, but it's so pivotal for the protagonist to show that growth in character arc, right? That change throughout, because again, it's not about a series of external things that are happening. It's about how it is affecting the internal state of the character, of the protagonist. So that's their moment when we start really seeing them start to get it. Maybe not fully get it, but they're like, oh, wait,
Exactly. And it's also a moment where sometimes, not always, but sometimes you might have a reversal. Like the character looks inward and they say to themselves, I don't really like what I see. Or they have that yes moment and they realize, like, actually, this is not all it's cracked up to be. I don't really want this thing anymore. And so then they kind of go in a different direction. So it can also create like almost like a mirror image where like the character's going toward the goal in the first half of the book, and then they're kind of going away from that goal in the second half of the book. Again, it's not always a clear reversal moment like that. That doesn't happen in every single book, but that is a possibility in the books.
Oh, and I think that's such an important point to make, the idea that just because the protagonist has a major goal, that they start at least after the inciting incident, that they have this goal. It doesn't mean that that goal has to be the thing that carries them all the way through the novel. Some novels it is, while other novels they can switch up their goals at the midpoint.
Exactly. I mean, like Dorothy wants her goal, like her goal is to get home to Kansas,
Mhm.
and she sticks to that goal until the very end when she's clicking her heels together. But Lizzie, her goal at the beginning of the book is actually she wants to be single. She doesn't want to be married. And really, what she wants is to be happy because she's single.
Right.
And then she gets to that pivot point. Her opinion of Darcy starts to change. And by the time we get to the end, she realizes that like she can still be happy, but it's not going to be by being single anymore. Now her happiness is to be with Darcy. Like she wants to be with him. And so it's like a change of heart. You know, she has this change of heart where she starts out wanting one thing and then she ends up wanting something different.
Yeah, and that's so important to realize, that it just is so story dependent. There, it's not a rule, and this is another reason why the three act structure is not paint by numbers. You have so many possible ways that it can go. So we're getting a little bit further into Act Two. We're almost done. We have this an all is lost moment. We have darkness. We have another pivot point. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so the second pivot point is the dark night of the soul. And basically, again, you have an external thing that happens and an internal choice. The external thing that happens is usually the thing that really wrecks the main character. Like it's their lowest point. It feels like, some people will call it the all is lost moment. It feels like all is lost, even though it's not necessarily. And then they have that moment where they sort of like, they have that dark night of the soul where they're like, can I really do this? Can I really make it through? What's interesting with the dark night of the soul is that there basically are only three choices that they can make at that point. They can either keep going the way they've been going,
Mhm.
they can give up completely, or they can make a different choice and they can go in a different direction. What's interesting with that is that giving up has to feel plausible. Now, you and I and all the readers know that the character's not going to give up because that would be a really, really bad ending. Like the
Yeah.
book would not be good, but it has to feel like an absolute possibility. Like it has to feel like a plausible choice for the character. Otherwise, them choosing to go on or them choosing to go in a different direction has no significance to it because of course they were going to do that. So it has to feel like giving up is a choice.
Yeah, and I think it's so true, and it's so daunting when you're writing sometimes within a genre where everyone knows that you know what I mean, where it's, for instance, if you're writing sweet romance or something like that,
Mm,
everyone knows there's going to be a happily ever after or a happily for now, right? So the idea of you really have to convince the readers, though, even though they know what's going to happen, that it might not, right? Even though they know. So that's so hard
exactly.
for writers.
It is hard. It is hard,
Yeah.
especially when you have those genre conventions that kind of where the story needs to end up.
Yeah.
But the thing, like going back to Pride and Prejudice, like we all know Lizzie and Darcy are going to end up together. We know
Yeah.
that from the first time they meet. Like we know that it's an enemies to lovers story and it's going to end up that way. But we don't know how it's going to get there. And we couldn't have predicted that it's going to be because her sister decides to run off with Wickham and then, all of those shenanigans occur. And then Darcy comes to the rescue and then they get together. We would never be able to imagine that at the beginning of the story. So like we know what the end goal, but like the how to get there is what's interesting.
Yeah, that's so true. It is the how do you get there, especially, and that is even when you rewatch something or reread something, the idea that if a storyteller is really doing a great job, even if you've seen it, even if you've read it, you still have that feeling like, right, I thought maybe this time, right? Oh, it still
Exactly.
feels emotionally real to you in those moments.
Exactly.
And so they make another, so they make their final big, big choice and they head on into Act Three. And what happens in Act Three?
So Act Three has three parts to it, the three C's. You've got the crisis, you've got the climax, and you've got the closure. The closure is also often called the denouement, which is just a fancy word for like tying all the loose ends.
Yeah.
So the crisis is like the ramp up to the climax, right? Like things are starting to pick up speed, there's momentum, we're getting close to that final battle, that big final, showdown scene, et cetera, et cetera. In the first Star Wars, Star Wars Episode 4, the crisis is when they're attacking the Death Star and like all the ships are kind of going in and they're like, flying through the trench and they're getting shot at by the TIE fighters and yada yada. The climax is the big shebang. It's like that moment of, where everything basically comes together. And usually like what happens at the climax is the major dramatic question. So the question that drives the whole story forward gets answered, and it gets answered one way or the other. Like you can't leave the reader hanging at that point. Now, this doesn't mean you have to tie up all the loose ends, but that loose end has to be tied up. So for example, in Pride and Prejudice, the big question is, are Darcy and Lizzie going to get together? And of course, when we get to the climax, they do. They do shortly thereafter. The climax is actually the scene where she has a whole big fight with Lady Catherine. In Wizard of Oz, the question is, will she get back to Kansas? And of course she does. So, that question gets answered one way or the other at the end.
Right. And so once you have done all the exciting stuff and you've answered that major dramatic question, what then is left? How do you tie up the loose ends? Like, what do writers expect in the denouement?
So the denouement could be any number of things, and it varies between like being really, really short. Like the denouement in The Wizard of Oz is literally that little mini scene at the end where she wakes up, it's been all a dream, and there's Auntie M, and there are all the farmhands, and they're all like, oh my gosh, you're better, you're okay. And, then she goes, there's no place like home, Auntie M, there's no place like home.
Right.
So it's really short. It's like a minute or something. Like it's really, really tiny relative to the whole book. But we don't need to see her like going and feeding the cows the next day. Like we don't need any of that. We just need to know that she's gotten home and that everybody's okay. And all the characters survived the tornado and they're all fine. In Pride and Prejudice, the denouement is more stretched out. Like we find out, like Lizzie and Darcy, after the Lady Catherine bit, he proposes to her. She says yes. She tells her sister. Then she tells her dad finds out, and they have a whole big conversation. And then, they finally get married. And then we find out like what's happened after they've been married. Kitty's been visiting them, and like they've always been friends with Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, and blah, blah, blah. So it really kind of stretches quite a bit. From the climax to the end. But that's because there are a lot of loose ends that need to be tied up. Like we need to understand like what really happened to all of the characters and how did they all, keep going afterwards.
Yeah, it's so funny with the denouement. I remember there are two stories that immediately come to mind, and they're both, well, one is a movie and one is a TV series. And I'm thinking about what modern viewers or readers feel with this. I don't know if you've ever seen the 1990s movie Dead Again.
No, I don't.
Okay.
If I have, anyway, it's been a while.
The denouement, it literally is like 2 seconds. And so it feels like it ends right after the climax. And I think this movie is absolutely marvelous, except for that ending. I was like, what? We don't get anything. It cuts to black. What is happening here? And then I'm thinking of Stranger Things. I don't know if you watched the end of the series, but it was like 40 minutes worth of tying up loose ends. So in your experience, how do you feel? What do you think modern readers feel? Do they want more or do they want less? Or is there a trend that you've noticed?
I think it's genre dependent. So I think, for example, mysteries, like cozy mysteries, the denouement tends to be relatively short. They find out who done it, and then sometimes the sleuth will explain how they figured it out. And then
Yes.
you'll have like that little like mini scene afterwards where like the sleuth is sitting with their cat and they're, having like a little moment or whatever.
Yeah.
Or they're like sipping tea while they watch, read the newspaper. And we get the sense of like life is back to normal, that everything has kind of come full circle. In some romance, particularly sweet romance, a lot of the books that I've read, there isn't even a denouement in the book itself. It's usually an epilogue, and it's usually like 3 months later or like a year later they finally
Mm.
they get engaged, and we see the engagement scene, or we see the marriage scene, or we see them off on their honeymoon or something like that. But like it ends with them having the big passionate climactic kiss, and then it just jumps to like 6 months later or something like
Yeah.
that. So it kind of depends on the genre, and it's really important for writers to read in their genre
Yeah.
and be familiar with like what are readers expecting, because and genre trends can change too over time. So you want to be reading like current books in the genre so that like this is what readers are expecting, this is what readers want, and what satisfies readers the most, and kind of yeah to be able to do that.
I love that point because that is certainly something I talk to the right, no matter what I'm teaching, no matter what I'm talking about, that point that you just made about everything is genre specific and it trends change. So the
Mhm.
idea of, for instance, I'm getting ready to be teaching a backstory class, which will probably already have been taught by the time this goes live. But the idea is, well, how much backstory is needed? I don't know. It's genre dependent. Go look at what's being published in. Here are the ways to do it, but the trends, right? How much do I include? Or how, whatever the thing is, how should it end? What should the midpoint be like? All of those things. It's like, what is popular now and what's happening in your genre?
Exactly. Exactly. So it's really important to read in your genre.
Yes, listeners, if there's one thing that you can take away, please go read in your genre. And I know that sometimes that doesn't happen as much as it should, right? Writers may like, well, I read romance, but I'm writing a thriller, right? So if you find that you don't already read current books in your genre all the time, just go do that.
Yeah.
Please go do that. Do lots of that. Okay, so actually, we're going to take a tiny step back because you have four possible ways a book can climax, and I wanted to ask you about that. What are the ways the story can end? What kind of endings can we have?
So they're basically the ending, the climax resolves based on two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Does the character get what they want? And do they still want that thing? So if they get what they want, so think of it as like a little 2 by 2 matrix, right? Like get what they want, yes or no, across the top. Do they still want it? Yes or no, along the side. So if they get what they want and they still want it, it's a happy ending. Now, a happy ending doesn't mean it's a happy story. The Hunger Games has a happy ending, but it is a very,
Right?
violent
Yeah.
story. Like there's a lot of heavy stuff in there. So it's not necessarily always like the story is happy, but it's that the ending is happy because the character gets what they want and they still want that thing. Now, if they don't get what they want, but they still want that thing, that is a tragic ending. So think just about every tragedy that Shakespeare's written, Romeo and Juliet, you name it. Characters still want whatever they were after at the beginning, but they don't get it. And therefore it's a tragic ending. Where things get interesting is when they don't necessarily want it anymore. So if they get what they want, but they don't want it anymore, that's a be careful what you wish for ending.
Ooh.
So, and those are actually really, really rare in novels. There are very few novels that do that because what happens most of the time in a novel is the character gets what they want or sort of gets what they want at the midpoint. And then they have that temporary triumph. And then they realize like, oof, this is not really what I thought it was going to be. And they go in a different direction. So
Mhm.
usually in a novel, you have that whole big long arc, but that moment of be careful what you wish for happens sooner. It happens at the midpoint.
Yeah.
The one example I can think of is the novella Ethan Frome, where he wants to be with this cousin or whatever, and it seems like it's going to go well for him, and then turns out it's not. It's all it's cracked up to be. So that's that ending. And then if they don't get what they want, but it turns out they don't really want it anyway, then that's a change of heart ending, and that would be so Pride and Prejudice is complicated because it actually is a change of heart ending and a happy ending at the same time.
Mm.
But if you're looking at it from the does she marry Darcy question, then it is a change of heart because she starts out hating him and then she ends up falling in love with him. Now, if you look at it from the perspective of her happiness, and at the beginning, like happiness is a thematic element that comes up over and over and over and over. So if you look at like what would make her happy at the beginning and then her being happy at the end, she's still happy. So she has like the happiness thread is still there. So she gets what she wants, which is to be happy. And she still wants it, which is, because she wants to be happy. So therefore it is a happy ending. So it kind of depends on like the lens that you're looking at it through, what ending you have.
That's awesome. And Gabriela has a really wonderful little graphic that's to a post that you had quite a while ago. I wonder if I can link that also in
Absolutely.
This. That might be fun for people to look at. So we're coming to the end of the interview, and I just wanted to know if there's one final piece of story structure advice or a reminder that you would like to give writers out there. What would you say to them? What's the biggest takeaway?
The biggest takeaway I would say is something we've already touched on a couple of times, which is the whole idea of it's not paint by numbers. Yeah. So it's not something where you have like a mental checklist and you're like, introduction, like act 1, check, check, check. Act 2, check, check, check. I've got a subplot. I've got a supporting character. I've got the midpoint. I've got this. I've got the 2 pivot points. It's not like that. It's really about using it to cross-check what you have and to see how the story is put together. So one thing I do a lot when I work with writers one-on-one is I'll have them write an outline, and then together we identify where all of those different landmarks fall. And then we look at like, is that act 1 really, really, really short? Is that act 3 really, really long? What's the balance of the acts and where are the different points falling? And like, do you have the second pivot point? Maybe they don't have a second pivot point and we need to insert one. And again, it's not a prescriptive thing. It's not about like, you have to make your story look exactly like the formula, but it's about being intentional. So the thing I always talk about at DIY MFA is this idea of instincts to intention. Most writers already have really good instincts because we read a lot and we're in the writing space and we're in the world of words. So our instincts are there. But if we're doing things on the page, we want to make sure that we're doing them on purpose and not just like, whoops, that happened. Yay. We don't want it to be happy accidents. We want it to be, intentional choices. So the whole idea of using the 3-act structure is it's like a tool that you can use to move from instinct to intention. You can look at like, this is what I have. Do I really want it to be that way? And if I do, great, leave it the way it is. But if you don't, then you can make adjustments accordingly.
Yeah. And I think it's also so important because it's a great way to identify if you have a gut feeling that something isn't working, it can show you what's not working. Because I know that when I'm working with writers, sometimes they'll be like, I know this thing isn't working, but I have no idea why. And it's like, oh, well, a pivot point was missed, or, the midpoint wasn't doing midpoint things, right? So it's like, oh, it's like getting an x-ray of your story and seeing where the bone is broken, right? It's like, oh, there it is. Now I can fix it.
Exactly. And like, you don't know if like, which bone is broken until you've done, sort of the exercise. Like maybe it's a bone in your hand and like you're wrapping up your foot. Well, that's not very helpful.
Yes, that's so true. I've seen a lot of writers wrapping up their foot when they needed to be looking at their hand. But yeah, no, that's exactly it. I love that. All right, Gabriela, before we go, you have a link that you're going to be sharing with me to put in the show notes. And where will that take our listeners?
Yeah, so the link is DIYMFA.com/join, JOIN. And what that'll do is it'll take you to a page where if you sign up with your email address, you will get a DIY MFA starter kit. And so it's kind of like a mini course that gets delivered over the course of about 2 weeks over email, where you get like little info packets. Like the email will explain the techniques and the ideas. And then you have like a worksheet packet that you can, or a worksheet that you can fill out and apply the techniques. And it hits on the 3 main pillars of DIY MFA. It's, one part of it is on writing, one part of it is on reading, and then one part of it is on community.
I love that so much. So if you're out there listening, definitely go click that link in the show notes and go get your starter kit so you can make sure that all the 3 of those pillars are being shored up. And Gabriela, thank you so much for being on the show. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Okay, my friends, one more thing before you go. If you're not already on my email list, you should know that that's where all the best stuff happens. Free classes, pop-up writing sprints, and things I only share with my email people. So click on the link in the show notes and get on that list. And don't be the person who hears about it after it's over. And one more super quick thing. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, the world needs your stories right now, so don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself. Talk soon.